Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Ivor Ichikowitz.
Having had the opportunity to sit through the deliberations of yesterday and today, I have a profound sense of déjà vu, a sense that I have somehow been here before, a sense that we are right back in the struggle as I experienced it in the 80s, a struggle for our identity as Africans, for our dignity, and for our ultimate liberation. The circumstances and times are certainly different, but the principles are exactly the same. So I want to invite you to journey with me into the new Pan-African Freedom Struggle 2.0. Journey with me as we look at the art of the possible. Amandla! Comrades, compatriots, sons and daughters of our great African continent, friends of Africa. As this conference and its deliberations come to an end, the hour of reckoning is truly upon us. The time has finally come for us to take note of the collective wisdom in this room and to reunite our collective struggle and fight for the confidence for a future that is truly our own. Our shared history is one of struggle, one of resilience, one of overcoming diversity, and one of standing firm in the face of exploitation. Those that have fought before us, our elders and our ancestors, have paid a very heavy price to get us to where we are today. But in my view, the struggle is far from over. We have not yet, as Africans, reached anywhere near our true potential. And today I call on each and every one of you and all of the people in your respective circles to stand united in this new struggle and rise as one to create the Africa that we all dream of. A strong, independent, confident Africa that the rest of the world has tried to prevent us from building in the past. The time has come to build the Africa that the rest of the world is petrified of. We envisage an Africa where all men and women are completely equal, where the shackles of colonialism are forever cast off, and where we for once and for all can stand proud and united, confident in our own ability to forge our own destiny. We yearn for an Africa that is no longer lurching from one crisis to the next. We yearn for an Africa that is free of crisis, either perceived or real. We yearn for an Africa where our abundant natural resources fuel our own progress and our own prosperity, not the ongoing greed of foreign powers. We yearn for an Africa where beneficiation of our raw materials is no longer optional. An Africa where industry processes what comes from our ground. We yearn for an Africa where any government that continues to allow such looting and pillaging and exploitation must be held to account. We yearn for an Africa where capital is accessible and affordable, and where capital providers no longer insult our intelligence by overpricing African risk just because they can and just because they always have. Our struggle is one for the creation of jobs in our own countries so that our people can be productive, have dignity, and have a stable income so that they can build long-term sustainable wealth. There's a perception that Africa's greatest wealth lies in its mineral resources alone. This, comrades, is not true. Our continent's greatest single asset is, in fact, its people. Our human capital has hitherto been completely undervalued. Our struggle is therefore one for education and enlightenment. We must make our children the vanguard of a new African renaissance, imbuing them with the knowledge, skills, work ethic, and most importantly, the passion to transform our continent through dedication and hard work. To change the world, we must first change ourselves. And that change begins with education. In order to do this, we need to ensure that access to the world's knowledge through low-cost, accessible data is enshrined as a basic human right, where access to information is democratized and where every single African, rich or poor, has access to the knowledge of the world always and from everywhere. Comrades, we must celebrate the fact that we are finally at a critical point in our history. We are finally at the point where our next generation of leaders are the first modern Africans who are truly born free. Born free of the shackles of colonialism, free of the shackles of apartheid, free of the perception instilled by the colonial powers and those that seek to control us that our Africanness is in some way a handicap. This is nonsense. The next generation of Africans waiting to take on the leadership of this great continent know that this is nonsense. This is a generation that knows that our Africanness is a God-given gift, that our Africanness is our superpower. Our dream of a new Africa is one free from the clutches of corruption, free from the clutches of tyranny, and free from the clutches of nepotism. We must cast aside these relics of a bygone era and build a society where democracy, transparency, and accountability reign supreme. This is a generation of African leaders in waiting who understands this. They no longer see government positions as a way to secure vast wealth. This is a generation that know that they have to work for their prosperity, a generation that no longer feels that the world owes them anything. You may well ask how I, a middle-aged, white, Jewish African, know all of this. Well, it's simple. I know this because the African youth have told me this. They've told me with confidence and with resolve. They've told me across the length and breadth of this great confidence. And they've told me in their tens of thousands as we've interviewed them for the African Youth Survey. The survey came about when I realized that my Africa, my colorful, vibrant, hope-filled, energetic Africa was completely different from the Africa that I was constantly told about as I visited the boardrooms of the United States, of the United Kingdom, and even of Beijing and Moscow. They kept telling me about the dark continent, the continent filled with challenges, the continent filled with corruption, the continent that was completely hopeless. And I realized that there was such a huge disconnect that for my own sanity, I needed to go and find out who was right. This is why we embarked on what has become the most comprehensive survey of its kind anywhere in the world. This project has presented many challenges, but now in its second edition, we can with great confidence say that young Africans see the continent as I do, and they are ready to reignite the struggle. Our data confirms that young Africans are optimistic, entrepreneurial, and impatient for change. They are no longer prepared to wait for aid or to be saved by foreign powers. They are no longer prepared to have their assets or their heritage looted. They are no longer prepared to be told what they can and can't do based on Western norms and conventions. They are no longer prepared to be considered in any way less capable than their counterparts from the rest of the world. And most importantly, they have made it abundantly clear that they are no longer prepared to wait for ineffective governments to provide. This is a generation who have the intention to take their lives into their own hands. They are ready to do whatever is necessary to ensure their prosperity, and if necessary, they will work around their governments to achieve this. One of the key differences in the struggle for Africa 2.0 is that this is a generation who don't just have a dream for Africa. This is a generation who have a business plan that is far more than just a set of hopes and aspirations. It is a well thought out plan to improve their lives and the lives of their communities. This is a generation with a business plan for a society where every voice is heard and respected and where justice is delivered without fear or favor. The realization of our African dream and the implementation of our African business plan necessitates economic independence, self-sufficiency, and the flourishing of homegrown businesses. The time has come for us to nurture, support, and celebrate our entrepreneurs, our innovators, and our visionaries, creating a fertile environment for African talent to thrive. We have to break away from this perception that success and wealth is something to be shunned or feared. We must stand as one against the forces of exploitation, ensuring that the fruits of our labor benefit our own people and that the interests of foreign powers are kept in check. Comrades, we have been hoodwinked for far too long into believing that we are dependent on the world's superpowers for our salvation. This is not true. It was, in fact, never true. We are more than capable of making our own reality on our own terms. We are more than capable of being partners who can stand toe to toe with our compatriots around the world. Comrades, brothers, sisters, Friends, let us resolve to march boldly into the African century. To march boldly, driven by our shared vision, our boundless potential, and our indomitable spirit. Together we will overcome the obstacles that stand before us, and we will build a future of hope, progress, and prosperity for all Africans. We are truly, in my view, at a turning point. We are at a point in history that we may not ever get to again. In my view, Africa's time is right now. Our time, collectively, is right now. We are truly the generation that we have all been waiting for. A luta continua. May the struggle continue.
Just go? Yeah.
We will be victorious. I think we're going to need that.
Okay. That was breathtaking, mind-blowing. Thank you so much for setting the stage in such a powerful way. I am very much intrigued with some of the key issues that you mentioned in your presentation. You mentioned how our greatest resource is not just our minerals, but actually our people as Africa. So Ivor, you're an astute businessman, a philanthropist, but you have invested your time in researching about youth. You published the African Youth Report. My question is, why are you interested in youth? What is it that you want to do with this data? Why did you think it's so important to focus on understanding this youth demographic?
For years and years and years, decisions about Africa have been made based purely on perception. Policymakers often have never even visited the continent. We're dealing with people who hold decisions that affect hundreds of millions of people in their hands who know absolutely nothing about the reality of this continent that we all call home. And honestly, it got to a point where I was just sick and tired of this nonsense. It got to a point where I decided that we had to start talking truth to power, and that we as Africans had to stand up for what we knew the facts were on our own continent. Sure, we have challenges. Sure, we have major, major things that have to be fixed on the continent, but not everything is bad. I don't see any miserable people here. I don't see anybody here who is ashamed of their Africanness. And yet the rest of the world kept beating us up based on perceptions that had absolutely no relevance to reality. And I'll be honest with you, at a point I started questioning my own sanity. So saying, hang on a second. There's so many people who see this continent so differently to the way I do. Maybe they're right and I'm wrong. And we decided to actually go out and put some science behind it. And there was a point at which I was a little nervous. You know, when the first set of results came out, I was kind of concerned. But I have to tell you that every single one of my personal perceptions was vindicated. We truly have been able to put science behind the truth. And slowly but surely, the intention is to blow holes in all of these negative completely malicious perceptions. And that's what our plan is.
That's excellent. And when I look at the first survey that was published, as you mentioned that there was some optimism. It talks about how there was an exciting Afro-optimism amongst Africa's youth. And then we look at the 2022, the most recent survey, showing a dip in that with about 28% of Africans feeling confident about their country, about 34% feeling confident about the continent. Why do you think we had that?
So it was very interesting. In the first edition of the survey that was done pre-COVID, the levels of optimism were unbelievable. The levels of hope, the levels of, there was just a buoyant spirit on the continent that was extremely, extremely exciting. Young Africans had showed a high level of entrepreneurialism, an irritation with government, but it wasn't the end of the world. And the second edition was conducted after COVID. It was conducted after people had really gone through living hell. You know, things were not easy on the continent during COVID. And for me, the dip in optimism was actually very, very small compared to the dip of optimism in optimism elsewhere in the world, because COVID proved how resilient we truly are as a continent. COVID proved how well we actually could survive crises. I mean, we as Africans know how to deal with crises. You know, I never forget meeting the president of Congo, of the DRC during COVID, and I just kind of had to crawl out of South Africa to get permission from the president to fly out of the country, and South Africa was in a complete lockdown. And I went to see him, and the first thing I asked him, because he kind of was grateful that I'd come to visit and knew how difficult it was that I'd got there, and for me to get there, and I said to him, well, how are you guys dealing with COVID? How bad is COVID? And he said, well, honestly, COVID, I'm not sure, but we've just isolated 3 villages with Ebola, and we've managed to avoid the spread of Ebola. And it suddenly struck me, you know, COVID's a major crisis to the rest of the world, but honestly, in Africa, small issue. We've got much bigger issues to deal with. And it was evidence of how resilient we truly are. And I think the results of the survey proved that. Africa's come out of this much stronger than many other countries, or many other continents in the world have. And many countries in Africa have actually in some way benefited from that experience.
And one of the things that also really struck me when I look at the results of the survey is the issue around democracy and how young people expressed that their preferred kind of government is democracy, like with 74% agreeing to that. However, 53% believing that Africa must develop their own kind of democracy. We often have these kinds of discussions at the Kennedy School around democracy, and African students here have also expressed that we must have our own kind of democracy. Now, what are your views on that, and how do we chart that kind of democracy?
53% plus me. I think that this is a very, very interesting part of what we survey. It's very interesting to note that democracy as a concept is well accepted on the continent. And it mustn't be taken for granted. In the first edition, we found that strong leadership was the preferred form of governance. I was about to say post-apartheid. Post-COVID, there is no question that the debate around a new form of African democracy has started happening. And I think that it is a major, major priority for us. This inflection point that I talk of is an inflection point that is generational. The democracy that has been imposed on Africa is a style of democracy that isn't even working in the West. You cannot tell me that this style of democracy that has been imposed in Africa is working in the United States, because it isn't. It's not working in Europe. How in heaven's name do we expect it to work in Africa, where we have to take into consideration the realities of our culture, the realities of our tribal influences, the realities of all of the things that affect us that have nothing to do with the West? And I think that we are at a point where we need to start having that debate. We need to start having it loudly. We need to start having it as at a continent level. And slowly but surely, we need to start looking at the constitutions of the countries that we live in and fix those problems in our democratic structure. South Africa today is on a downward spiral because of the style of democracy that we've put in place in South Africa. If you don't fix that, you're never going to fix South Africa as a project. And the same applies for many other countries on the continent.
I'm curious to know what that kind of democracy might look like. I know this is something we need to figure out as a continent, but it's interesting to see models that have been explored by other countries. So China has its own kind of leadership. The US has a different kind of leadership. Is there something in the middle? What might that look like? Or is there an African country that sort of demonstrates in that direction what that might look like? Or this is something we need to reimagine in the spirit of the theme for this conference?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I'm looking forward to a long, very exciting partnership with Harvard to come up with the next style of African democracy. I don't think, though, that there's a one style fits all. I think that every single country has its unique circumstances. We must never forget that Africa is a continent, it's not a country. And we must never allow anybody to forget that. You know, one of the things I wanted to look at in the youth survey is whether we could have the audacity to talk of an African youth. I mean, when you're in Dakar, you are closer to New York than you are to Johannesburg. The African continent is immense. The geography is immense. The language divide is immense. The cultural divides are immense. Can we talk about something as simple as an African youth? The good news is we can, because there is a collective youth consciousness in Africa. But it is very presumptuous to believe that one style of democracy can fit the entire continent. And I think that as we had these debates in the 60s and the 70s about what an independent Africa should look like, we should be having the debate today about what an African style of democracy, an African style of government, an African style of governance should look like country by country. And it's going to be up to your generation and to your colleagues. It's very unpopular to call them comrades, but my comrades, to work out what this is going to look like. And I'm very excited to be able to stand on the sidelines and share with you what I know doesn't work so that your generation can get it right.
I like that, and I like that you mentioned that it's going to be up to our generation and your fellow comrades. Now, talking about our generation, many of them don't want to get into politics, the young people. We are 70% of the continent, but it's just not an appealing pathway, and yet we need to represent the majority of the population. And so I'm wondering, I know that this came out in your survey as well, and I'm wondering whether it is complacency on the part of us as the young people, or it is the older generation that is gatekeeping to the degree that it's inaccessible for your youth to actually get into politics and governance. So how do we build the Africa that we want when we exclude our young people from politics and governance?
So one of the really concerning things that came out of this edition of the survey is fewer and fewer young Africans want to go into politics. Historically, it was easy. A path to politics was a path to prosperity. Why? Because politics was about looting and pillaging. We have a generation today that doesn't believe in looting and pillaging. They can see that through hard work that they can create wealth, they can create opportunity outside of politics. So the challenge is, how do you take intellect back into politics? And my view is that the answer to that is to change the nature of how we run countries in Africa. We created an environment in the revolutionary movements where we sold to our people the idea that government would provide. You know, I had the privilege of working in the information department in the African National Congress just before the 1994 elections. And I wrote a slogan which I beat myself up about every single morning. We wrote a slogan that said, vote ANC, and we will provide you with a house, we will provide you with a job, and we will ensure your prosperity. How dare we have done that? Because what it did is it created an entire generation of people waiting for their government to provide. No government can provide. Ask Donald Trump, he'll tell you. Government's job is to create an enabling environment. Government's job is to create infrastructure that allows us to provide. And if we can break that legacy of the past, just that one thing, the continent will look completely different, not in 20 years' time, but in 5 years' time. And I think that if we can get your generation to understand that we need technocrats to run African governments, we need competent people to run African governments, we need CEOs as heads of state.
True.
We need people that can actually read a set of accounts to be ministers of finance. And then the face of the continent will change. We'll get there, slowly.
Absolutely. Okay, I will now open it up to the audience for Q&A. I can see very quick hands on this table. We'll take a round of 3 and then take another set afterwards. So there's hands here, and then there's a hand at the back. Go ahead, yes.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for that speech and thank you for talking about this. You know, as a youth, an African youth, I completely agree with what you're saying, and it's kind of like the problem is we talk about the youth and we talk about how the youth is the future, but there isn't much being done to involve the youth. Talk about politics, talk about entrepreneurial. We say this is possible, and there is no really program out there to inform us more about it, to teach us how to start it. It's like, are we expected to just magically know how to do it? You know, there isn't any kind of program that is educating us or guiding us to what the right path is, or what worked and what didn't work. Because without that, it just feels like we might repeat the same thing over and over again. And you know, earlier on, we talked about the free trade agreement and how the potential it has, but no one is talking about program to facilitate like a network of getting young entrepreneurs, young African entrepreneurs to connect with each other in a more intercontinental way. It just seems like very isolated and more of a talk. It's really just a conversation and no action is really being implemented into that. What's your insight on that, and what do you recommend for us to do to get in a better state for that?
Thank you. Sabella?
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for a very insightful set of comments. Siseko Kumalo, Harvard South African Fellow, and I am glad to have a fellow South African in the room. I'm curious about something that you mentioned, though, in terms of democracy on the African continent, and there's a particular point vis-a-vis the South African context in terms of it being on a downward spiral. I am concerned, however, about the ways in which our colleagues in South Africa, you're talking jurisprudence scholars, are writing about constitutionalism in the country, calling it unconstitutional. And the concern that I have there is that you have senior scholars, HODs of departments of jurisprudence, directors of centers for applied legal studies, and professors across the country who are charging the nation in a fundamentally irresponsible way. Now, as we do the work of reimagining democracy in Africa and thinking about it in the South African context, how do we do that work responsibly and in ways that keep the framework of the constitutional outline of South Africa working? Of course, it's a liberal constitution. It is borrowed from a Rawlsian overlapping consensus here in the United States. We had consultants coming in pre-1994, pre-1996 to give us what we have currently. How do we work with that in ways that do not facilitate absolute nihilism in the country? The second question that I have is to say that as a senior leader within the African continent, and I believe I'm borrowing from my good colleague's comment or question earlier, how do we create intergenerational spaces of information sharing, where we can sit down with leaders of industry, leaders of government, leaders of business, to think about the ways in which young people can become absorbed into these various sectors? Because if you look at, and I did this experiment in 2018, I believe it was, the mean age of the cabinet in South Africa, I believe, is something like 58, if not 60. And the majority of the young people in the country, the majority of the, the mean age of the country from the last national census that we had, I believe, is about 28 or 32, between thereabouts.
And falling.
So if you think about that challenge or that mismatch, that rift, how do we create spaces where we can sit in similar rooms with folks and say to them, this is what we believe the action plan should be in terms of policy, and how do we implement that policy with the expertise that the older generation bring to the table? Thank you.
Thank you. I think let's respond to those. You're going to remember?
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Chidi Ansel Odinkalu. I come from the Democratic United Federal Republic of Nigeria. So let me, there's a sentence you offered which is very exciting. We need CEOs to run countries. So let me tell you the story of, a real life story of one CEO running one country. No, it's a real life story. Look, in 1993, Nigeria appointed a CEO of the biggest company in Nigeria called United African Company, which is a successor, or was a successor of the Royal Niger Company, which was chartered in 1886 to run the country as a colonial entity and to run Nigeria. And he survived for all of 87 days, after which soldiers quietly marched him off into pension, and the country went into trouble. And my question is, prolonged trouble, and many people would argue Nigeria is where it is as a result of appointing one inept CEO who had spent a lot of time in the boardrooms, but actually knew nothing about the streets, lacked legitimacy, and did not know about the armories. So my question is, where are these your CEOs who know something about the African streets, and how are you going to get them into places where they can get into leadership with legitimacy? Thank you.
Well, all very insightful questions, and nowhere near enough time to answer them all. So let me deal with that one first, because you're 100% correct. A CEO who can run a sugar company can't run a country. The point is that show me a university course somewhere in the world that trains heads of state. And the truth is that being a head of state has similar attributes to being a CEO, but you'd better well know how to plug into the street. You'd better well know how to run an armory, and you'd better well know how to be a diplomat at the same time. And most of the heads of state, sadly, and we have some very competent heads of state in Africa. Let's dispel this illusion that every head of state is inept and incompetent. Not true. We have some remarkable leaders in Africa, but most of these leaders learn their craft only once they're in power. And I think it's a long discussion, but your point is well taken. You can't take somebody who knows how to run a shipping company and ask them to run a country. And we can have a long debate about Nigeria, but there are many, many lessons that come out of Nigeria, which leads me straight into answering part of both of your questions. How many people in this room study African history? Not nearly enough. In my mind, the African history should be compulsory in every school and in every university, because we have one of the richest, most remarkable histories, and that history holds a huge amount of lessons, not only for what we've done wrong, but also for what we've done right. You know, we invest a huge amount of time and effort through the African Oral History Archive in collecting original testimony from people who were involved in landmark events on the continent. And we've done so because I realized that my understanding of the continent comes from the fact that I had the privilege of knowing some of the remarkable personalities that were able to lead South Africa through what was a social, political, economic, existential crisis. And that crisis was resolved not because of a linear history, but because of the remarkable people on the stage at that time. And by collecting that original testimony, we are allowing that history to be accessible without editorial comment. And the problem with history, unfortunately, or African history generally, is it's always told by the victors, and so much of it has a colonial spin to it. But if you go and study the raw data, you'll find many of the answers that you're looking for. So that's one issue. The second issue is this perception that the youth of Africa have to be invited into leadership roles is part of our own paranoia. It's nonsense. Why has the youth voice been ignored for so long in Africa? It's because our revolutionary movements designed the youth wing to be the rabble-rousers. Our governments think of our youth as being the troublemakers. And I'm sorry, for a long time we were. It was what our job was. But that has changed. You today have a youth where even the youth that have not had the privilege of a formal sector education are today educated. I had a gentleman walk into my offices a few months ago who had not finished secondary school, who had never been to university and was an IT professional. He today runs our entire IT infrastructure without 1 day of formal sector training. His entire education comes off YouTube. And he used to go and sit in the local community center and steal Wi-Fi from a policeman. And that's where he got his education. And frankly, I have other people in the organization who have master's degrees from LSE who are not a patch on this guy. So don't believe that formal sector education is what makes the African youth educated. So this inflection point that I talk about is an inflection point where even the uneducated are more educated than the educated were in my generation. And in order, and I don't believe anybody needs to sit and wait to be invited into playing a leadership role. The issue is play a constructive role. Play a constructive role in your communities, play a constructive role in your countries, and your skills will be recognized. We are telling African heads of state, and I have the privilege of traveling the length and breadth of the continent, talking to heads of state all the time. And what is the message I'm giving them? I'm saying ignore the voices of your youth at your own peril. if you don't talk to your youth, if you don't bring them into government, if you don't give them an opportunity to take leadership roles, they are going to take them anyway. And you know what? People are starting to listen. They're coming back to us and saying, help us write a plan. Help us bring us actionable intelligence. Share with us what our measurable action plan should be to better engage with our youth. So, kind of partial answer to question 2. You and I are going to have a dinner over a long bottle of red wine because you're 100% correct. You know, this is not a time when responsible people should be playing politics irresponsibly. I think that the judiciary, certainly South Africa, has some very unique challenges at the moment. I live with the experience of the roller coaster ride that is South Africa. We are going through a temporary major challenge. It'll come right. This is only temporary. You know, our struggle was not a struggle to get to where we are today. It was a struggle to get to beyond where we are today. And we will. It'll be generational, but we'll get there. And I'm very confident of that. But in the interim, what has happened is everything has become politicized. The media is the biggest culprit. The opposition parties in South Africa are actually a bigger culprit for the challenges in the country than the ruling party that they're all against. Why? Because we're in the business of negative politics. There's very little constructive engagement happening in the interest of the country. It's now just get rid of the ANC because they're old and tired and we're irritated with them at all costs. And that's not constructive. So there's a lot to discuss, and you're 100% correct. What will change the tide in South Africa, and South Africa is not unique. I see this happening in other countries in Africa, including, by the way, Nigeria, where the politics has to be about what's in the interest of the entire in the entire country, where the revolutionary movements of the past have to realize that they have a shelf life. The challenge we're going through in South Africa, the challenge you're going through in Zimbabwe, the challenge that many other African countries have gone through, clearly the challenge that Ghana has got through is the challenge of realizing that revolutionary organizations either need to reinvent themselves or they need to appoint liquidators. There's a point at which their shelf life, there's a point at which they start becoming a bit smelly.
Thank you. I think that's a very powerful way of answering questions and, in a sense, concluding our discussion. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do another round of questions because of our time. But I think to quote key action points, both for governments and young people, you said that government ignore young people at your own peril. So we do have government represented here.
Come up with a hashtag for me, please.
And young people, do not wait to be invited to the table. You have to be constructive and go for the table. Thank you so much.
I have one final closing comment.
Sure.
You are the generation that we've been waiting for. Don't forget that. Because if you think that somebody else is going to come along and do your job, then you're going to let me down terribly. So if you take nothing away from this conference other than the fact that every single one of you have the future of the continent in your hands, the same way as my generation had it in its hands at that time. We screwed up a little. We got some stuff right, but you're going to get less stuff wrong. And that's my greatest hope and my greatest wish for what comes out of this process.
Thank you very much. Just one more announcement before Ivor leaves. We have copies of the Africa Youth Report on this table. Feel free to grab copies of the report. Thank you. Another round of applause for your keynote address.